Hello, dear travellers, and welcome back to our fireside gathering where the warmth of shared stories keeps the cold at bay. Tonight, as frost creeps across windows and darkness comes early, I invite you to journey with me into the heart of winter itself. Not the gentle winter of our world, but the long, terrible winter of Westeros, where the cold can last a generation and ancient terrors walk in the darkness. Picture old Nan, wrinkled and nearly blind, leaning close to young Bran Stark's bedside. Her voice drops to barely a whisper as she speaks words that will haunt him. "Oh, my sweet summer child, what do you know of fear? Fear is for the winter, my little lord, when the snows fall 100 feet deep and the ice wind comes howling out of the north." Let us begin where all northern winter stories begin, with the long night itself, that generation-spanning darkness that occurred 8,000 years before the events we know, in the midst of a winter that seemed as if it would never end. This was not merely a season, but a transformation of the world itself, a time when the very fabric of reality seemed to tear and allow something ancient and terrible to seep through. Old Nan's stories about the long night were not simply tales to frighten children, though they certainly accomplished that purpose. They were warnings carved into the collective memory of the North, passed down through countless generations with a solemnity that suggested something more than legend. When she spoke of that ancient winter, her voice carried the weight of true history, even if the details had been worn smooth by the passage of millennia. "Fear is for the long night," she would say, her nearly sightless eyes somehow seeing into the past, when the sun hides its face for years at a time, and little children are born and live and die all in darkness, while the dire wolves grow gaunt and hungry, and the White Walkers move through the woods. Imagine what those words truly meant. A darkness so complete, so enduring, that children could be conceived, grow in their mother's womb, be born, live their entire brief lives, and die without ever seeing sunlight. The darkness was not merely the absence of light, but seemed to be something with substance, something that pressed in on the mind and soul as much as on the eyes. During the long night, thousands starved as crops withered and died in the perpetual cold. Livestock froze in their barns despite every effort to keep them warm. Families huddled together for warmth, burning everything they could find: furniture, shutters, even the timbers of their own homes, in desperate attempts to stay alive. The stories tell of mothers who smothered their babies rather than watch them slowly starve, weeping as they did so, feeling their tears freeze on their cheeks before they could fall. Kings froze to death in their castles, same as shepherds in their huts. The cold did not discriminate between high and low, noble and common. It came for everyone with equal hunger. In those days, the great houses that would later dominate Westeros were just beginning to form, and many families that might have become powerful dynasties simply ended, entire lineages erased by the relentless cold. But the cold itself was not the true horror of the long night. The cold was simply the herald of something far worse. The others, those beings of ice and death, that emerged from the uttermost north, from the lands of always winter, where even in summer the snow never melts. They came walking through the darkness on feet that left no prints, their blue eyes glowing with cold fire, their crystalline swords shattering steel at a touch. The others brought with them an army of the dead, corpses reanimated to serve as mindless soldiers in an eternal war against life itself. These whites, as they came to be called, were perhaps even more terrifying than their masters because they wore familiar faces, fathers and brothers and sons, now twisted into something no longer human, moved by a will that cared nothing for the bonds of blood or love. The oldest histories speak of the others moving through the woods in the darkness, and this detail is crucial to understanding Northern winter fears. They were not confined to open battlefields or frozen wastelands. They came through the forests, those deep woods where Northerners had always felt safe, where they hunted and gathered and lived their lives. The others transformed those familiar places into nightmare landscapes, where every shadow might hide death, where every crack of ice might signal the approach of something that should not exist. How did humanity survive? The stories are fragmentary, contradictory, altered by time and the agendas of those who recorded them. The oldest histories were set down by septons thousands of years after the events, and the septons had their own reasons for shaping the narratives. The first men left only runes carved into stone, cryptic symbols that might be prayers or warnings or simply names of the dead. What seems certain is that the first men and the children of the forest formed an alliance, setting aside their ancient enmities to face the greater threat. There are legends of a hero, sometimes called the last hero in the north, who traveled into the heart of winter seeking aid from the children. The stories say he set out with 12 companions, a dozen good men who swore to follow him into the darkness. One by one they died, killed by the cold, by the others, by despair itself. His horse died, his dog died, his sword shattered from the cold. Yet still he pressed on, alone in the darkness, until at last he found the children and convinced them to join the fight. Other traditions speak of Azor Ahai, a hero from the east who forged a great sword called Lightbringer through terrible sacrifice and wielded it to drive back the darkness. Whether these are the same hero or different ones, whether they truly existed or are amalgamations of many heroes compressed into single figures, no one can say with certainty. What is known is that somehow, through courage and sacrifice, and perhaps magic, the living prevailed. The others were driven back into the uttermost north, back to the lands of always winter from which they had emerged. Brandon the Builder, perhaps the most famous figure of the Age of Heroes, raised the wall, that immense structure of ice and magic stretching 100 leagues from the Bay of Seals to the Shivering Sea, 700 feet high, cutting the lands of always winter off from the rest of Westeros. The wall was not merely a physical barrier. The children of the forest wove powerful spells into its construction, ancient magic that would prevent the others from crossing. The Night's Watch was founded to guard the wall, an order of warriors sworn to defend the realms of men against the dangers lurking in the north. For 8,000 years, that defense held. But the North never forgot. The North could not afford to forget. When old Nan told her stories of the long night, she was not engaging in idle entertainment. She was performing a sacred duty, passing along knowledge that might one day mean the difference between survival and extinction. Every northern child heard these tales, and they carried them into adulthood, and they told them to their own children in turn. The stories became part of the northern soul, woven into the very identity of what it meant to be a Northman. Winter is coming, House Stark warned, and those words meant far more than a simple weather prediction. They were a reminder that the long night had happened once and could happen again. They were a call to eternal vigilance, a refusal to become complacent during easy times. They were a declaration that the North would be ready when the darkness returned, as it inevitably must. The long night shaped northern culture in profound ways. It explained why Northmen were harder than their southern neighbours, less given to frivolity and excess. It explained why they stored grain so obsessively, why they built their castles so strong, why they valued loyalty and duty above all other virtues. The long night taught them that when winter comes in earnest, only those who stand together survive. The lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. It also explained the northern attitude toward the dead. While southerners buried their deceased in elaborate ceremonies, northerners learned long ago that winter was a time to burn the dead, to commit them to fire rather than earth. The stories from the long night told of corpses rising to fight against the living, and no northerner wanted to take that chance. Better to reduce a loved one to ash than risk them returning as something twisted and wrong. The long night legends also gave birth to a particular northern pessimism, a darkness in their humour and world-view that outsiders often found disturbing. Northerners understood, in a way southerners did not, that disaster could strike at any moment, that long summers inevitably gave way to terrible winters, that hope must always be tempered with realism. They loved and laughed and found joy where they could, but always with the understanding that darkness waited at the edge of the firelight. When the masters of the citadel sent forth their white ravens to announce the arrival of autumn, wise lords throughout the realm began storing grain. But in the north, they had never stopped storing grain, not even during the longest summers, because they knew, they remembered. The long night was not just history, it was prophecy, a promise that winter would come again, and next time might be the last time. In a world where winters can last for years or even decades, preparation is not optional, it is survival itself. The relationship between harvest and winter in Westeros, particularly in the north, forms the fundamental rhythm of life. When the masters declare that autumn has arrived based on their measurements of temperature and day length, it triggers a flurry of activity that will determine whether families and entire regions will survive the coming cold. The harvest feast serves as both celebration and grim assessment. It is a time of joy for the bounty gathered, but also a time of calculation and worry. How much grain has been stored? How many livestock can be kept alive through the winter? How long might this winter last? The unpredictability of Westerosi seasons makes these calculations treacherous. A summer might last 10 years, making people complacent, before giving way to an autumn of 5 years, and then a winter lasting 2 or 3 years. Or, as the old stories warned, a winter might come that lasted a generation. When Bran Stark hosted the harvest feast at Winterfell during the War of the Five Kings, the event revealed the complex social and practical functions these gatherings served. Lords from throughout the north descended on Winterfell with their retinues, ostensibly to celebrate the harvest, but in reality to meet with their liege lords, to assess the political situation, to forge alliances and settle disputes, and yes, to show off the bounty their lands had produced. The feast itself was a spectacular display. Aurochs roasted with leeks, their meat falling off the bone after hours over fire pits. Venison pies, the crusts golden and flaky, filled with chunks of deer meat and rich gravy. Mutton chops sizzling with fat, seasoned with herbs from the glass gardens. Duck and peppered boar, gooseberries where the sweetness of the fruit cut through the richness of the fowl. Pigeon and capon, beef and barley stew thick enough to stand a spoon in. Cold fruit soup to cleanse the palate between courses. White Harbour sent seafood in abundance. Whitefish and winkles, crabs and mussels, clams and herring, cod and salmon, lobster and lampreys. The fruits of the sea complemented the fruits of the land. Black bread made from hardy northern grains, honey cakes dripping with sweetness, oaten biscuits that could keep for months without spoiling, vegetables that grew well in the northern climate, turnips and peas, beets and beans, squash and red onions, wheels of white cheese that had been aging in cool cellars. Course after course after course, so much that even young lords like Bran could manage only a bite or two of each dish. The abundance was intentional, even necessary. The harvest feast served as a display of prosperity, yes, but it also served as a final celebration of plenty before the lean times ahead. When winter truly set in, such lavish meals would become impossible. Better to enjoy the bounty now, to feast while food was plentiful, to fill bellies and strengthen bodies before the hunger of winter arrived. But the feast was also pragmatic in its excess. Much of the meat came from animals that could not be kept alive through the winter. Better to slaughter them now to feast on fresh meat while it was available, than to watch them slowly starve in snowbound pastures. The emphasis on game animals, aurochs, venison, duck, boar, pigeon, reflected the need to preserve domesticated livestock. Cows and sheep and goats were more valuable alive, producing milk and cheese and wool, than dead. Hunt the wild animals now, save the stock animals for later. The storing of grain required careful calculation. When the Meisters declared autumn, wise men began setting aside a portion of their harvest, though the recommended percentage was fiercely disputed. Too little, and you starve when winter proves longer than expected. Too much, and you might waste resources that could have sustained you through autumn. Some Meisters recommended storing 1/5 of the harvest immediately upon autumn's arrival. Others suggested waiting to see how long the autumn lasted before committing to heavy storage. Northern lords had learned through bitter experience to err on the side of caution. The North had seen too many winters where southern advice proved inadequate. While southern lords might store 1/10 of their harvest and consider themselves prudent, northern lords stored 1/3 or even half, accepting present scarcity to guard against future famine. The actual process of storing grain was complex and labor-intensive. Grain had to be kept dry, protected from rot and vermin. Storehouses needed to be well ventilated yet secure, large enough to hold vast quantities, yet small enough that the grain's own warmth didn't cause spoilage. The rich built stone granaries with clever designs that allowed air circulation while keeping out moisture. The poor made do with raised wooden structures that kept grain off the ground and away from flooding. Salt became as valuable as gold in the preparatory months. Meat could be preserved by salting, allowing it to last for months or even years. Fish from White Harbour and other coastal towns were packed in salt barrels, creating provisions that could sustain communities through the darkest days. Smoking meat was another preservation technique, hanging beef and pork and venison in smokehouses, where they would slowly cure in the aromatic smoke of hardwood fires. Root vegetables that could survive storage, turnips and parsnips, beets and onions, were packed in sand or straw in cool cellars. Apples were wrapped individually and stored in the dark. Cabbages hung from cellar rafters. Squash and pumpkins lined root cellar shelves. Every scrap of food that could be preserved was preserved, because waste in autumn meant death in winter. The glass gardens of Winterfell represented a significant advantage in the winter survival. Built over the hot springs that warmed the castle, these greenhouses allowed food to be grown even in the depths of winter. Vegetables and fruits even some flowers, could be cultivated year-round, providing fresh food when everything else was preserved or frozen. Not every castle had such advantages, but those that did guarded them jealously. Firewood became an obsession. Trees were felled and cut and split and stacked, creating enormous stores of fuel. Every family needed to maintain fires constantly through winter for warmth and cooking and light. The poor often found themselves with impossible choices: burn wood to stay warm but risk running out before spring, or endure the cold to make supplies last longer. Many didn't survive these calculations. Livestock that would be kept through winter needed fodder. Hay was cut and dried and stored in huge quantities. Grain was set aside not just for human consumption, but for feeding animals. The survival of breeding stock was crucial. Lose your animals, and you had nothing to rebuild with when spring finally came. The psychological preparation was perhaps as important as the physical. Families understood that they might be trapped in their homes for months, unable to venture outside due to snow and cold and the dangers that winter brought. They prepared projects and tasks to occupy themselves, ways to pass the long, dark hours. Wool would be spun, cloth would be woven, tools would be repaired and sharpened. Boredom and cabin fever could be as deadly as cold or hunger if not properly managed. Communities drew together during these preparatory months. Neighbors helped neighbors, understanding that individual survival often depended on collective action. Barn raisings, grain storage construction, mass meat preserving. These became communal activities. The understanding was that today you helped your neighbor store his grain, and tomorrow he would help you slaughter your pigs. The North understood, perhaps better than any other region, that the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. The harvest feast then represented the culmination of all this preparation. It was a moment to pause before the darkness, to celebrate what had been accomplished, to steel oneself for what lay ahead. The songs and stories shared at these feasts were not idle entertainment, but rather reinforcement of cultural memory, reminders of how previous generations had survived similar trials. When the singer performed The Night That Ended, accompanied by drums and the huge, curved war horn blown by Hodder Umber, it was more than music. It was ritual, a communal remembrance of the greatest danger their ancestors had faced and overcome. The song told of the Night's Watch riding forth to meet the others in the battle for the dawn, and its performance at the harvest feast reminded everyone that winter meant more than cold and hunger. It meant eternal vigilance against ancient evils. Outside the walls of Winterfell lies a settlement unique in all of Westeros, the Winter Town, a place that swells and shrinks with the seasons, its population ebbing and flowing like a tide governed by the approach and retreat of winter itself. Understanding the Winter Town means understanding how Northerners adapt to the brutal reality of their environment, how they survive conditions that would destroy less resilient peoples. During spring and summer, the Winter Town is largely empty, perhaps 4/5 of its houses standing vacant, their shutters closed and doors barred. Only the permanent residents remain, the innkeeper at the smoking log, merchants who maintain year-round businesses, craftsmen whose skills are always in demand. The streets are muddy but passable. The market square sees reasonable traffic, and life proceeds at a manageable pace. But when autumn arrives and the Meisters send their white ravens, when the temperatures begin their inexorable decline and the first snows dust the battlements of Winterfell, everything changes. As old Nan would tell the Stark children, when the snow fell and the ice winds howled down out of the north. Farmers left their frozen fields and distant holdfasts, loaded up their wagons, and then the winter town came alive. They came from everywhere, farmers from throughout the region, their harvest gathered and their livestock reduced to only what could be sheltered and fed through winter. Villagers from small settlements that could not sustain themselves through a long, cold season. Fishermen from frozen harbours where their boats lay trapped in ice. Hunters whose game had disappeared into winter dens or fled south. They came with wagons loaded with everything they owned, stored grain and salted meat, tools and furniture, chickens in cages, and sometimes a cow or pig, if they were lucky enough to keep one. They came with their children wrapped in furs and their elderly supported on carts, knowing that their old homes would not protect them from what was coming. The clansmen from the northern mountains began their descent as well. These hardy folk lived in the high valleys and mountain meadows north of Winterfell, in a landscape so remote and harsh that it seemed almost uninhabitable. During summer, they managed well enough, hunting mountain goats and sheep, gathering what grew in the brief mountain growing season, trading with lowlanders when opportunity arose. But winter in the mountains was something else entirely. When winter came to the mountains, it came with a special ferocity. Snow fell not in feet, but in fathoms, burying entire valleys. Temperatures dropped so low that exposed flesh froze in minutes. Avalanches swept down slopes without warning, erasing holdfasts and people alike. Game disappeared completely, either frozen to death or fled to lower elevations. The mountains became a white hell where survival was nearly impossible. So the clans adapted with a brutal practicality born of necessity. The young were sent down to the winter town or to larger castles where they might find work and shelter. Strong young men hired themselves out as guards or labourers. Women found positions in kitchens or stables. Children were fostered to families who could feed them. It was understood that these youth represented the future. If they survived the winter, they could return to the mountains in spring and rebuild. But what of the old? Feeding extra mouths through a long northern winter is difficult enough. When those mouths belong to strong workers who can contribute, but the elderly, those too frail to work, those who consumed resources without producing anything in return, they posed an impossible problem in a world where resources were always limited and winter could last for years. The northern clans had a tradition for this, one that outsiders found horrifying, but which the clans themselves approached with a kind of grim dignity. Old men would simply announce one morning that they were going hunting. They would gather up their few possessions, take down weapons that might have hung on walls for years, and walk out into the wilderness. Some were found come spring, frozen corpses lying beneath the snow. Many more were never seen again, their final resting places known only to the wolves and crows. This was not murder. No one forced these old men to leave, and indeed families often begged them to stay. But the old men understood mathematics. Every mouth fed meant less food for everyone else. Better to die with some dignity, to go out under open skies seeking one last hunt, than to slowly starve while watching children go hungry because of your presence. Some of these old hunters actually did hunt. They might take down a deer or mountain goat, providing meat for their clan one final time before the cold claimed them. Others sought more direct ends, walking into snowstorms or lying down in clearings and allowing the cold to take them in their sleep. A few particularly brave or perhaps desperate souls sought out threats. Bears, shadow cats, even the occasional giant or wildling raider, hoping to die in battle rather than from exposure. It was a hard tradition, a cruel tradition perhaps, but it was also a practical one born from thousands of years of hard winters. The clans did not apologize for it. They honored these old hunters, remembered them in songs, told stories of their courage. Going hunting was considered an honorable end, a final act of service to family and clan. It was, in its own way, a choice, a refusal to be a burden, a determination to face death on one's own terms. When the winter town filled to bursting, it could house perhaps 15,000 souls, transforming from a sleepy settlement into one of the largest populations in the north, rivaling White Harbour and Barrowton. The logistics of feeding and housing so many people strained even Winterfell's considerable resources. The market square bustled with activity as people bartered and traded, trying to acquire necessities before winter truly locked everything down. The Smoking Log, the local inn, did steady business, its common room packed with people sharing news and stories. Drinking ale that would have to last until spring allowed brewing to resume. Merchants sold winter supplies at inflated prices, furs and thick woolen clothing, oil for lamps, candles made from every available fat and wax. Blacksmiths worked overtime repairing tools and forging nails and hinges and other necessities. Coopers made barrels for storing food and water. The streets, already muddy in autumn, became nearly impassable as thousands of people and animals churned them into a morass of half-frozen slush. Sanitation became a constant battle. Disease was always a threat when so many people crowded together in cold weather. The smell must have been remarkable. Thousands of unwashed bodies, animals penned close, smoke from countless fires, all mixing together in the cold air. Yet, for all its hardships, the winter town also represented safety. Within its bounds, protected by proximity to Winterfell's walls and the guards who patrolled them, people found shelter from the dangers of winter. Wolves, both the natural kind and the supernatural direwolves, prowled the wilderness in winter, desperate with hunger. Wildlings from beyond the wall sometimes raided south during winter months, seeking food and shelter. In the worst winters, darker things might emerge from the frozen forests. The Starks understood their responsibility to these people. The Lord of Winterfell was not simply a military commander or administrator, but a protector, and that duty intensified during winter. The great castle's storerooms held enough grain to feed not just the castle's garrison and servants, but also to provide emergency supplies to the winter town if starvation threatened. This was expected, part of the unspoken contract between lord and small folk. The northern lords who visited Winterfell for the harvest feast understood this obligation as well. They brought gifts of food and goods, ostensibly for the feast but really as contributions to Winterfell's winter stores. It was a recognition that if Winterfell fell, if the Starks could not protect and provision the north, then everyone suffered. The collective security of the north depended on the strength of House Stark and the castle that was their seat. Living conditions in the winter town were cramped and uncomfortable. Multiple families might share a single small house, sleeping in shifts, eating in shifts, organizing their entire lives around the constraints of limited space and resources. Privacy became a luxury no one could afford. Tensions inevitably rose. Disputes over food, over space, over obligations and debts. The Stark guards and local magistrates worked constantly to keep peace, settling arguments before they could escalate into violence. Children found ways to play even in these conditions. They built snow forts and had snowball fights, skated on frozen ponds, learned to use miniature weapons in imitation of their fathers and uncles. These games were not idle. They were training, preparation for the day when these children would be adults responsible for their own survival and that of their families. Women gathered in groups to work together, making the endless tasks of winter survival more bearable through companionship. They spun wool, sewed clothing, told stories, sang songs. The songs were often sad ones, tales of loved ones lost to previous winters, but they were also hopeful, reminding everyone that winter always ended eventually, that spring would come again. The winter town represented something profound about northern culture. The understanding that survival required community, that the pack survived when the lone wolf died. Northerners were famously independent and self-reliant, but they also understood when independence had to yield to interdependence. Winter was that time. When the ice winds howled, when snow fell by the fathom, when darkness came early and stayed late, survival meant standing together. High in the northwestern mountains of the north, in valleys so remote that no roads reach them, dwell the mountain clans, 40 distinct groups, large and small, each fiercely proud of their identity and traditions. These are the Wools and the Liddles, the Harkleys and the Burleys, the Norries and the Flints and the Knots. They represent something ancient in northern culture, a living connection to the first men and the old ways that have faded elsewhere in Westeros. The mountain clans worship the old gods with an intensity that even lowland northerners find remarkable. The heart trees in their hidden groves have faces carved by the children of the forest themselves, or so the clansmen claim. These weirwoods have witnessed 10,000 years or more, their red eyes weeping sap through winter and summer alike. The clans believe, perhaps more strongly than anyone else in the Seven Kingdoms, that the old gods are real and the watching, that the faces in the trees are not mere symbols, but genuine portals through which divine or at least magical observation occurs. To insult a clan's heart tree is to invite death. Jon Snow warned Stannis Baratheon about this, when the would-be king considered cutting down weirwoods to make siege towers. The old gods are strong in those mountains, Jon explained. The clansmen will not suffer insults to their heart trees. This was not idle warning. The clans had gone to war over less, had fought each other and outsiders with equal ferocity to defend their sacred groves. The relationship between the clans and the House Stark runs deep, deeper than simple feudal obligation. The Starks themselves descended from the first men and kept the old ways even after most of the South converted to the faith of the Seven. This shared heritage created bonds that transcended mere politics. The clans called Eddard Stark the Ned, not as an insult, but as an honor, using the traditional form of address that stemmed from the first men themselves. When a clan chieftain spoke of the Liddle or the Wool, they were not being crude or dismissive. They were employing an ancient tradition that emphasized the role over the individual. The chieftain was the embodiment of his clan, just as the Stark in Winterfell represented all Starks, past and present and future. This tradition created continuity, a sense that the current leader was merely the latest in an unbroken line stretching back to the age of heroes. The clans were noted for their hospitality, each chief attempting to outdo his rivals in generosity when guests arrived. This was not mere competition for its own sake, but a recognition that in the harsh mountain environment, hospitality could mean the difference between life and death. A traveler caught in a mountain storm might freeze to death if denied shelter, Therefore, providing hospitality was both duty and honor, a demonstration of prosperity and power. The ability to feed and house guests proved that your clan was thriving. But this hospitality came with expectations. Guests were protected absolutely while under a clan's roof, but they were also expected to behave honorably, to respect the clan's customs and sacred places, to give fair value in trade or information or service. Violation of hospitality was one of the gravest crimes in clan culture, punishable by exile or death. The clans had feuded with each other for centuries, disputes over territory and honor and ancient wrongs that had long since passed from memory into legend. Songs remembered these conflicts. Black pines and wolves in the hills told of clan wars, of raids and counter-raids, of heroes and villains whose names were still invoked in curses or blessings. The feuds were serious enough that only the Starks could bring the clans together, could call them to peace or to war under a unified banner. Living in the mountains required adaptations that lowlanders never needed to develop. The clansmen were expert climbers, able to traverse slopes that would kill flatlanders. They knew how to recognize the signs of avalanches, how to move safely across snowfields, how to find shelter in storms that could appear with terrifying speed. They hunted mountain goats and sheep with bows made from weirwood, animals so agile that catching them required tremendous skill. Their clothing was purely functional. Furs and leather, layered for warmth, designed to shed water and block wind. Bright colors and southern fashions meant nothing in the mountains. What mattered was staying warm and dry, maintaining mobility despite heavy clothing, being able to move silently when hunting or raiding. The clans developed a particular fondness for shadow skin cloaks, made from the pelts of the shadow cats that prowled the high places. These cloaks were both practical and symbolic, marking the wearer as dangerous, as someone who had killed or commissioned the killing of one of the mountain's apex predators. When winter came to the mountains, it transformed an already harsh environment into something nearly unsurvivable. Snow could fall for weeks without stopping, accumulating to depths that buried small buildings. The wind howled through passes with a sound like screaming souls. Temperatures dropped so low that breath froze and fell as ice crystals. Days became short, just a few hours of dim light before darkness fell again. The clans had learned to read winters, to predict roughly how harsh each one would be, based on signs and omens, the thickness of animal furs, the behavior of birds, the feel of the air as autumn progressed. When the signs indicated a truly terrible winter approaching, the clans made their hardest decisions about who would stay and who would go. Those who went hunting were given honor, but not pity. The clans understood necessity. They held no illusions about the kindness of their world. The old men themselves understood, and more often than not, made the choice without prompting. They would gather their descendants, offer final wisdom and blessings, then simply walk away into the wilderness. Some clans held brief ceremonies. Others let the old hunters depart without fanfare at their request. There was no shame in tears, but neither was there any attempt to change what must be done. The old hunters often chose their paths carefully. Some sought out places of beauty they had known in their youth, a particular valley or frozen waterfall, a grove of trees where they had courted their wives, a hunting ground where they had taken their first kill. They would sit in these places, sometimes building small fires if they had the means, and let the coal take them while surrounded by memories. Others went more actively hunting, determined to provide for their clans one final time. Mountain goats were wary and difficult prey, but an experienced hunter might take one down, providing meat that could sustain his family for weeks. These hunters often cached their kills in places where they would be found, marking them with stacked stones or broken branches before going off to die separately. The meat would freeze naturally, preserving it until clansmen could retrieve it. A few old warriors sought out enemies, wildling raiders who sometimes ventured into the mountains, dangerous animals, even giants on rare occasions. These warriors hoped to die in battle, to take an enemy with them if possible, to have songs sung about their final stand. Clan mothers would later tell children about their grandfather, who faced down 3 wildlings alone, or their uncle, who fought a shadow cat with nothing but a knife. The young, who went down to the winter town, or to serve at castles, faced their own challenges. They were often viewed with suspicion by lowlanders who considered the mountain folk backward and savage. The clansmen had different customs, different ways of speaking, different attitudes toward authority. They were proud and quick to anger, unused to taking orders from anyone except their own chiefs and the Stark in Winterfell. But they were also valued for their fighting abilities. Clansmen made excellent warriors. They were tough, skilled with weapons, unafraid of hardship. Northern lords who earned their respect could count on loyal service. Robb Stark, when he called his banners, received strong support from the clans because they remembered his father's justice and honor. Later, Stannis Baratheon gained their support not through power, but through respect. By taking Jon Snow's advice about how to approach them properly, by honoring their customs even though he found them strange. The clans carried their culture with them wherever they went. They maintained their clan identities fiercely, even when scattered across the north. A wool in White Harbor might not see another wool for months, but he remained a wool, loyal to his chief, bound by his clan's traditions. When clansmen from the same group encountered each other away from the mountains, they treated each other as brothers, sharing news and resources, watching each other's backs. This clan solidarity extended to gender relations as well. The mountain clans did not share southern attitudes about the proper roles of men and women. Clan women were expected to be tough, to contribute to survival through whatever means necessary. They hunted and fought when needed, managed clan resources, made decisions about important matters. Some became leaders in their own right, commanding respect through wisdom and strength. The clans preserved old stories that had been forgotten or corrupted elsewhere. They sang songs from the age of heroes in their original forms, without the sanitizing edits that septons and maesters had introduced over the centuries. They remembered heroes and villains whose names meant nothing to Southerners. They kept alive the knowledge of ancient places in the mountains, old ruins from before the first men, caves where the children of the forest once dwelt, stone circles whose purposes had been forgotten, but which still commanded reverence. When spring finally came and the young clansmen could return to their mountains, they brought with them new knowledge, stories of the lowlands, understanding of how the wider world worked, sometimes new skills learned during their time of service. But they also brought back a renewed appreciation for their heritage. Having seen how others lived, they understood more clearly what made their own way of life valuable, what was worth preserving even as the world changed around them. The mountain clans represented one of Westeros's most ancient cultures, largely unchanged for thousands of years. While great houses rose and fell, while kingdoms formed and shattered, While religions spread and faded, the clans remained in their mountains, keeping the old ways, worshipping the old gods, surviving winters through the same brutal pragmatism their ancestors had practiced in the Age of Heroes. They were a living connection to Westeros's past, a reminder that beneath all the chivalry and politics and southern refinement lay a much older, harder, colder world. In a world without widespread literacy, where the small folk cannot read, and even many nobles struggle with letters, songs, and stories serve as more than entertainment. They are the mechanism by which culture perpetuates itself, how history is preserved, how warnings are transmitted across generations. In the North particularly, where winter can erase entire communities and where isolation makes written record scarce, songs and stories become sacred trust. The Night That Ended stands as perhaps the most important song in Northern culture. It tells of the long night, of the others emerging from eternal winter, of the desperate battle that nearly extinguished humanity. But it's not a simple narrative. It's a song specifically designed to be memorable, with rhythms that lodge in the mind and imagery that haunts the imagination. At the Winterfell harvest feast, when the singer reached the part where the Night's Watch rode forth to meet the others in the battle for the dawn, Hodder Umber brought forth his huge curved war horn banded in silver and blew a blast that set all the dogs to barking. This was not random showmanship. The horn blast served multiple purposes. It marked the climactic moment in the song. It reinforced through sound what words described. It woke everyone up and demanded attention. In a hall filled with people made drowsy by food and drink, that horn blast ensured everyone remembered this moment. The song continued as musicians joined in with spinning skirls on bladder and wood harp, creating a complex soundscape that elevated the performance beyond simple singing into something approaching ritual. When Mors Umber seized a passing serving girl and began dancing, others joined in, and suddenly the entire hall was celebrating not just the harvest, but also the victory their ancestors had won over ultimate darkness. This was how culture was transmitted in the North, through songs that became communal experiences that engaged multiple senses, that created memories so vivid they would be recalled years later. Children who attended that harvest feast would remember the night that ended for the rest of their lives. When they had children of their own, they would teach them the song, and with it, the essential message. Winter brings danger, but humanity can prevail through courage and unity. Old Nan's stories served a similar function, though her approach was more intimate, more personal. She didn't perform for crowds, but rather sat beside individual children, speaking in that cracked voice that somehow made every word more haunting. Her stories were not sanitized versions suitable for delicate sensibilities. They were the real thing, dark and terrible and true. She told Bran about the rat cook, the servant at the Nightfort, who had murdered a king's son and served the father a pie made from the son's flesh. This was not merely a spooky story, but a teaching tale about the sanctity of guest right, about the terrible consequences of violating hospitality. The gods had punished the rat cook not for murder. Murder was common enough and sometimes justified, but for breaking guest right. They transformed him into a monstrous rat, forever hungry, forever searching for food that would never satisfy him. The rat cook story carried practical warning as well. The Nightfort where this occurred was real, a castle on the wall where terrible things had happened over the centuries. Children who heard about the rat cook understood that places could be cursed. that evil left echoes, that some locations should be avoided. When the Night's Watch eventually abandoned the Nightfort, moving to Castle Black instead, everyone understood why without needing explanation. Mad Axe was another Nightfort story Old Nan told. A man of the Night's Watch who went mad and murdered his brothers with an axe, going barefoot so they wouldn't hear him coming. The Prentice boys who witnessed the murders gave different descriptions of what they saw, and 3 died that same year. 1 went mad, and later they were seen shambling in chains behind something dark and terrible. Was it the others? Was it some other evil? Old Nan left that deliberately vague, letting the imagination fill in the horror. These stories taught vigilance. They warned that madness could strike anyone, that brothers might become enemies, that the Night's Watch faced threats from within as well as from without. They reinforced the importance of staying alert, of trusting but also verifying, of maintaining discipline and structure even when everything seemed safe. Danny Flint's story was heartbreaking in a different way. She disguised herself as a boy to join the Night's Watch, perhaps seeking adventure or fleeing some horror at home. Her brothers discovered the truth, and she was raped and murdered. Old Nan told this story to girls particularly, warning them about the dangers of transgressing boundaries, but also as a commentary on the cruelty that could exist even among supposedly honorable men. The Night's Watch, sworn to defend the realms of men, had contained men who committed atrocities against the innocent. The 79 Sentinels was another Nightfort tale, men who continued standing watch even after they died, their corpses remaining at their post as frozen statues. Were they honored dead maintained in death as eternal guardians? Or were they whites, corpses animated by the others and somehow trapped in this form? Old Nan never clarified, but the image of dead men still standing watch reinforced the central theme of the Night's Watch. Duty persists beyond death. The watch never ends. Simeon's star eyes featured in many tales. A knight who lost his eyes but replaced them with star sapphires, allowing him to see in death or dream, or perhaps through magic. He saw hellhounds fighting in the Nightfort, adding another layer to that accursed place's terrible reputation. Simeon represented the triumph of will over physical limitation, but also served as a reminder that seeing truly might require more than mortal eyes, that perception could be enhanced or altered through supernatural means. These stories formed a comprehensive education about the North's real history and persistent dangers. They taught children about the others and their whites, about the importance of the Night's Watch, about the sanctity of guest right and the consequences of violating it, about the reality of evil and madness, about places where the boundary between natural and supernatural grew thin. But the stories also taught resilience and hope. The night that ended concluded with victory, with the others driven back and humanity preserved. The last hero's story, which Old Nan told in various versions, emphasized that even when all seems lost, even when companions die and weapons shatter and hope fades, pressing forward might reveal unexpected aid. The hero's determination to continue even after losing everything was held up as the highest virtue, the quality that ultimately saved humanity. Other songs told of different kinds of winter survival. Black Pines and Wolves in the Hills recounted clan feuds, but also demonstrated how Northerners endured through the long cold months by maintaining their identities, by refusing to surrender to despair, by finding reasons to fight and live even when conditions were brutal. Songs about Bran the Builder reminded listeners that the great achievements of their ancestors, the Wall, Winterfell, Storm's End, and other legendary structures, had been accomplished in the Age of Heroes when conditions were even harsher than present days. If Brandon the Builder could raise a 700-foot wall of ice stretching 100 leagues, modern northerners could surely survive a bad winter. Love songs provided necessary counterweight to all the darkness. My Featherbed and The Bear and the Maiden Fair offered humour and warmth, reminding people that life contained pleasures worth preserving. These songs were particularly popular during winter, when people desperately needed relief from constant stress and fear. Work songs helped pass time during tedious tasks. Grinding grain, spinning wool, chopping wood. All these necessary winter activities became more bearable when accompanied by song. The rhythms helped coordinate group efforts, made time pass faster, created community through shared performance. Mothers sang lullabies to children frightened by howling winds or creaking shutters. These soft songs promised safety, painted pictures of spring's return, helped little ones sleep despite the darkness and cold. The lullabies were not dismissive of danger, but rather acknowledged it, while insisting that the child was protected, that the darkness outside could not reach them here by the fire. Old Nan particularly understood the power of voice and delivery. She would adjust her tone for different stories, dropping to a whisper for the most frightening parts, forcing listeners to lean in close to hear her. She would pause at strategic moments, letting silence build tension. She would suddenly speak loudly at jump scare moments, startling her audience. These techniques enhanced the impact of her stories, made them more memorable, ensured they would be retold. The stories and songs of winter served multiple functions simultaneously. They preserved history, transmitted cultural values, provided warning about real dangers, taught practical survival information, offered entertainment and comfort, created community bonds, and gave people reasons to endure. In a world where winter could last years and kill without mercy, these songs and stories were as necessary to survival as stored grain and stockpiled firewood. The North had learned through bitter experience that skepticism could be deadly. What Southerners dismissed as superstition, Northerners understood as ancient wisdom. The world contained forces beyond human understanding, and survival required respecting those forces even if one could not fully comprehend them. Chief among Northern beliefs was the absolute necessity of burning the dead during winter. While Southerners buried their deceased in elaborate ceremonies, often in crypts that became family shrines, Northerners looked at a corpse during winter and saw potential horror. The stories of the long night told of the dead rising to fight against the living, and no Northerner wanted to risk such a thing. When someone died during winter, the body was burned as quickly as possible. If conditions permitted, a proper pyre would be constructed, stacked with wood and kindling, the body placed atop it. The deceased family and friends would gather to say final words, to remember the person they had known, and then fire would be set. The flames consumed flesh and bone, reducing everything to ash and fragments that could never rise as a white. In the harshest conditions, when fuel was scarce and weather made outdoor fires impossible, bodies might be burned in hearth fires or ovens in whatever way could be managed. The propriety of the ceremony mattered less than the fundamental requirement. Reduce the body to ash, prevent reanimation, protect the living from the dead. This practice had practical benefits beyond preventing supernatural threats. Bodies buried in frozen ground didn't decay properly. they might remain preserved in ice for years. Disease could fester in these corpses, spreading to anyone who disturbed them. Wolves and other scavengers might dig up shallow graves, scattering remains in unsanitary ways. Fire solved all these problems definitively, but the superstition went deeper than mere pragmatism. Northerners believed, or at least acknowledged the possibility, that the boundary between life and death was thinner than Southerners admitted. They had seen too much strangeness, heard too many stories from reliable sources, experienced too many unexplainable events to dismiss all tales of the supernatural as mere fancy. The old gods presented another complex belief system that Southerners misunderstood. The faith of the Seven taught that the Seven were distinct beings with individual personalities: the father, the mother, the warrior, the smith, the maiden, the crone, the stranger. But the old gods were different, vaguer, more diffuse. Were they actual deities? Were they spirits of the forest? Were they the children of the forest themselves, or the lingering consciousness of dead greenseers absorbed into the weirwood network? Northerners didn't have clear answers to these questions, and generally didn't seek them. The old gods simply were. A presence felt in the quiet of God's woods, a watching through the eyes of carved weirwood faces, a force that might help or hinder, but that demanded respect regardless. Prayer to the old gods was less about asking for favors and more about acknowledging one's place in the natural order. The weirwoods themselves inspired a particular reverence mixed with unease. These trees with their bone-white bark and blood-red leaves, with faces carved into their trunks that seemed to weep red sap, were clearly special, clearly different from ordinary trees. They were sacred to the old gods, connected somehow to the children of the forest, possibly containing the consciousness of ancient greenseers. To harm a weirwood was to invite disaster. When Andals invaded Westeros thousands of years ago, they cut down weirwoods wherever they found them, viewing them as demon trees and their worship as paganism. The North, which successfully resisted the Andal invasion, kept its weirwoods and its faith. The mountain clans particularly would not tolerate any insult to their heart trees. Cutting down a weirwood might provoke clan war, might bring curses from the old gods themselves. During winter, the godswoods of the north became places of particular power and strangeness. Snow-muffled sound, creating unnatural quiet. The red leaves of the weirwood stood out starkly against white snow. The faces carved in the trees seemed more animated, as if the cold somehow made them more active. Northerners prayed in the godswoods during winter, seeking favor or forgiveness, or simply acknowledging forces greater than themselves. Ghost fences and wards represented another layer of superstition. Certain patterns of stones, certain symbols scratched into door frames, certain herbs hung in specific ways. All these were supposed to provide protection against malevolent forces. Did they actually work? Difficult to say, but people who maintained such wards and survived the winter saw that as a proof, while people who neglected them and died obviously couldn't report whether the wards would have helped. Salt had protective properties beyond its food preservation uses. Circles of salt laid around buildings were supposed to keep out evil spirits. Salt thrown on doorsteps prevented harmful magic from entering. These beliefs probably stemmed from salt's value and rarity, from the idea that something so precious must have power beyond the physical. But many northerners swore by salt's protective properties and wouldn't neglect such simple precautions. Iron also possessed protective qualities. Cold iron specifically forged steel rather than worked iron, was said to ward against fairies and spirits and darker things. The Night's Watch preferred iron weapons partly for practical reasons. Iron was cheaper and more available than steel for most of their history, but also because folk wisdom held that the others and their whites could be harmed by cold iron. Dreams carried significance in northern belief. Vivid dreams, recurring dreams, dreams that came true. All these were seen as messages from the old gods or perhaps from dead ancestors. Greenseers and wargs experienced particularly powerful dreams, but even common folk understood that dreams could contain truth. A dream of wolves at the door might warn of actual danger. A dream of a dead relative might carry genuine advice or warning from beyond death. Warging itself represented one of the North's deepest and strangest beliefs. Southerners dismissed tales of skin changes as fantasy, but the North knew better. The Starks possessed the blood of the first men in concentrated form, and with it came ancient gifts. Some Starks could enter the minds of animals, see through their eyes, control their actions. This was not metaphor or madness, but genuine magic, real power flowing from bloodlines that stretch back before history. The gift came with dangers and taboos. Warging into humans was considered abomination, a violation so severe that even other skin changers condemned it. Yet it could be done. Bran did it to Hodor, taking control of the simple-minded stable boy's body when necessary. The violation was undeniable, but so was the necessity in certain circumstances. This created moral complexity that Northerners preferred not to examine too closely. Animals that bonded with wargs became more than simple beasts. They retained animal instincts but gained something of human intelligence. Conversely, wargs who spent too much time in animal bodies began taking on animal characteristics. They moved differently, thought differently, saw the world through changed perspectives. The boundary between human and beast could become dangerously blurred. When a warg died, their consciousness could transfer into their bonded animal, allowing a kind of second life. But this life was limited and strange. The human mind slowly faded, overwhelmed by animal instinct, until eventually only the beast remained with perhaps some shadow of human memory haunting it. This half-life was considered better than true death, but also carried its own tragedy. Certain numbers held significance. 3 was sacred, 3 ravens, 3 blasts of the horn, 3 days and 3 nights. 7 was also important, though that came more from southern influence, from the faith of the 7. 13 was unlucky, the number of the Nightfort's evil history, the 13th Lord Commander who became the Night King. Winter storms were not merely weather, but carried omens. The direction the wind blew indicated what kind of winter was coming. Snow on certain holy days meant severe cold ahead. Thunder during winter was considered extremely bad luck, possibly foretelling deaths in the family. These beliefs helped people feel they had some control, some ability to predict and prepare, even when facing forces far beyond their power to influence. Breaking guest right was the ultimate taboo, combining practical and supernatural consequences. The host who harmed a guest under his roof brought curses upon his house. The Red Wedding, where Walder Frey massacred Robb Stark and his men during a wedding feast, violated guest right in the most spectacular way possible, and the Freys suffered for it, though whether through divine retribution or human revenge, or simple consequence of their actions remained debatable. The line between superstition and practical wisdom often blurred. Was it supernatural wisdom to burn the dead, or simple hygiene? Did iron really ward off evil, Or did believing it did give people the courage to face danger? Did the old gods actually watch through the weirwoods? Or did people project their own moral sense onto carved faces? Northerners generally didn't worry about such distinctions. What mattered was survival. And if superstition helped achieve that goal, then superstition was valuable regardless of its objective truth. The wall dominates the northern landscape and imagination both. 700 feet of solid ice mixed with stone and gravel, stretching 100 leagues from the Bay of Seals to the Shivering Sea. The wall represents humanity's greatest achievement and its most necessary defense. But more than physical structure, the wall exists as an idea, a symbol, a constant reminder of ancient dangers that once nearly destroyed the world. According to legend, Brandon the Builder raised the wall with the aid of giants and the magic of the children of the forest. Whether this was literal truth or mythologized memory of an earlier age's accomplishments, no one could say with certainty. But the wall's very existence proved that the first men and the children must have worked together, must have accomplished something extraordinary, because no current power could replicate such a structure. The ice itself seemed unusual, denser and harder than normal ice, more resistant to melting even in summer. Some maesters theorized that magic had been woven into the wall's construction, spells that prevented the others from crossing. This magic supposedly still held, which explained why the White Walkers remained beyond the wall for 8,000 years, rather than sweeping south whenever they pleased. The Night's Watch was established to guard the wall, and, by extension, to guard all of Westeros against threats from the far north. In the beginning, the Watch was honored, respected, composed of volunteers from noble houses who saw service on the wall as sacred duty. But 8,000 years is a long time, and memory fades. As centuries passed with no sign of the others, Southerners began viewing the Night's Watch as an exile post for criminals and unwanted sons, a dumping ground for society's refuse rather than a crucial defense force. This created a difficult situation. The Watch desperately needed manpower to adequately garrison the wall's many castles, yet the quality of recruits declined steadily. Rapists and thieves, poachers and cutthroats, younger sons with no prospects and bastards with even fewer. These became the Watch's mainstay. Some proved worthy of their vows, transforming from criminals into honorable defenders. Many others remained exactly what they had always been, men who took the black to escape justice rather than from any sense of duty. The Night's Watch oath bound members for life. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. It shall not end until my death. I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father no children. I shall wear no crowns and win no glory. I shall live and die at my post. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the shield that guards the realms of men. I pledge my life and honor to the Night's Watch, for this night and all the nights to come. These words carried real weight in the north. When a man said those vows before a weirwood tree, he bound himself absolutely. Breaking Night's Watch vows was desertion, punishable by death. Even lords of great houses would execute deserters without hesitation, understanding that the Watch could not function if its members could simply leave when bored or frightened or homesick. The Watch operated on principles that seemed harsh, but were necessary given their circumstances. Desertion meant death, not imprisonment or lesser punishment. This severity stemmed from the understanding that if men could leave easily, none would stay. The conditions on the wall were brutal. Endless watches in freezing cold, constant danger, no possibility of normal family life, hard labor maintaining the wall and castles. Only ironclad duty and the certainty of execution for desertion kept the watch functioning. The walls' castles had been built to house thousands of men each. Castle Black, the watch's headquarters, could garrison 500 easily. East Watch by the sea, West Watch by the bridge, the Shadow Tower, all these and more dotted the wall's length, positioned to provide comprehensive defense. But by the time of the main story, the Night's Watch had dwindled to fewer than 1,000 men total, forced to abandon most castles and concentrate their limited numbers in just 3 main fortifications. This decline reflected the realm's broader forgetfulness about real dangers. With no attacks by others in living memory, with wildlings seen as the primary threat and wildlings being merely human enemies, most people considered the Night's Watch to be fighting yesterday's war. Why send good men to the wall when there were no monsters to fight? Why support the watch with money and supplies when those resources could be spent on more immediate concerns? The North understood better than the South, having longer memories and being closest to the danger. Northern lords still sent recruits to the watch, still provided supplies, still remembered that the wall served a necessary function, even if the others hadn't been seen in millennia. House Stark particularly maintained strong ties with the Watch, understanding that the Stark in Winterfell bore responsibility for supporting the realm's first line of defense. Life on the wall was extraordinarily hard. The wind blew constantly, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes during winter. The ice beneath Rangers' feet was slippery even with iron spikes on their boots. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes and noses with regularity. Discipline had to be maintained despite the men's criminal backgrounds, requiring harsh punishment for infractions. Food was bland and repetitive: salted beef and porridge, onions and turnips, black bread and ale. The Wall's brothers divided into 3 orders: Rangers, who ventured beyond the wall to scout and patrol; builders, who maintained the structure and its castles; and stewards, who handled logistics and supplies. Each order required different skills, and men were assigned based on aptitude rather than preference. A nobleman who joined expecting to become a ranger might find himself assigned to stewards, serving food and shoveling horse dung. The watch leveled all men regardless of birth. Winter on the wall was particularly brutal. The already harsh conditions became nearly unbearable. Snow fell constantly, piling up to heights that threatened to bury doors and passages. Ice coated everything: the wall itself, the castle's battlements, stairs and walkways. Simply moving around became dangerous. Watches had to be maintained regardless of weather, meaning brothers stood in exposed positions during blizzards, often returning to shelter with frostbite or worse. Supplies became critical issues during winter. The watch depended on support from the realm, on deliveries of food and fuel and equipment. When winter storms made roads impassable, when conditions prevented regular shipments, the watch survived on what they had stockpiled. This made autumn preparations as crucial for the watch as for anyone else. Store enough food for a winter that might last years, because resupply might not be possible until spring. The castles themselves were marvels of practical design despite their decay. Thick walls provided protection from wind. Fireplaces in every chamber helped maintain livable temperatures. Storage cellars kept food frozen naturally during winter. Wells provided water, though sometimes the water would freeze and have to be melted. Everything was built with survival in mind. Comfort was never a consideration, only functionality. The watch's primary responsibilities had evolved from their original purpose. Instead of defending against others, they now mainly dealt with wildlings, the free folk who lived beyond the wall and sometimes raided south of it. These were human enemies with human motivations, fighting for survival just like the Watch itself. Some brothers saw wildlings as the enemy, others as people trapped in a bad situation. This moral complexity made relationships with wildlings complicated. Ranging beyond the wall required tremendous courage and skill. The wilderness north of the wall was vast and dangerous. The haunted forest stretched for leagues, filled with ancient trees and the hidden valleys. The Frostfangs, a mountain range of terrible height and cold, made southern mountains look friendly by comparison. The lands of always winter lay beyond even the Frostfangs, regions so cold and hostile that no human could survive there for long. Rangers tracked wildling movements, mapped the wilderness, tried to understand what was happening in the vast territory beyond the wall. They traveled in small groups, surviving on skill and experience, knowing that a mistake could mean death from cold or animals or wildlings. The Rangers were the eyes of the Watch, providing intelligence that might give warning if truly serious threats emerged. The Watch maintained an arsenal of tools for signaling and communication. One blast of the horn meant Rangers returning, 2 blasts meant wildlings, 3 blasts meant others, a signal that hadn't been used in living memory until the main story's events. Ravens carried messages between castles and to the realm proper. Fire beacons could be lit to call for aid. These systems allowed the Watch to coordinate despite the vast distances involved. Despite everything, despite declining numbers and reduced support, and the loss of their original purpose in common memory, the Night's Watch persisted. Brothers still swore their vows, still stood their watches, still maintained the wall. They did this not because they expected recognition or reward, but because the vows had been spoken, duty had been accepted, and true brothers of the Watch honored their commitments regardless of circumstance. When the others finally did return, when the real threat emerged from the deep north, just as old Nan's stories had warned, the Night's Watch stood ready. Depleted, undersupplied, with brothers who were criminals and cast-offs rather than heroes, but ready nonetheless. Because at the end of everything, someone had to stand in the darkness. Someone had to be the shield that guards the realms of men. And for 8,000 years, through good times and desperate times, that someone had been the Night's Watch. Westeros is vast, stretching from the desert of Dawn in the south to the frozen wastes beyond the wall in the north. This geographical diversity means winter manifests differently across the realm, and different regions have developed distinct traditions and attitudes for dealing with the cold season. Understanding these variations reveals much about each region's character and values. In Dawn, the southernmost kingdom, winter is almost gentle compared to the north. Temperatures drop and rain becomes more common, but snow is rare except in the high mountains. Dawnish winters might last as long as winters elsewhere, but they lack the life-threatening severity that defines northern cold. Consequently, Dawnish culture developed no elaborate winter preparations or survival traditions. Dawnish men view northern winter customs with a mixture of incomprehension and vague horror. The idea of storing half your harvest for potential years-long winter seems excessive. The notion of burning the dead rather than properly interring them in family crypts strikes Dawnish sensibilities as disrespectful. Stories about old men going hunting to die in the wilderness sound barbaric. To Dawnish minds, the north is a harsh land that breeds harsh people. Necessary perhaps in their environment, but unfortunate nonetheless. This southern perspective on winter creates tension when northerners and southerners interact. When Catelyn Stark, born a Tully of the Riverlands, first came to Winterfell, Ned told her, "The north is hard and cold, and has no mercy." This was not metaphor but literal truth, a warning that her southern upbringing had not prepared her for the realities of northern winter. Many southern women who married northern lords struggled with this adjustment, some never fully adapting. The Reach, that fertile region ruled by House Tyrell, experiences more significant winter than Dawn, but nothing approaching northern severity. Reach winters are cold enough to halt growing seasons, requiring stored food and careful resource management, but not cold enough to regularly kill people. The Reach's elaborate gardens and orchards, its magnificent feasts and refined culture, all these flourish, partly because winter never becomes truly deadly there. Reach culture developed winter traditions focused on maintaining civilization and comfort, rather than bare survival. Winter tourneys provided entertainment and maintained martial skills. Elaborate balls and feasts continued throughout winter, albeit drawing on stored food, rather than fresh harvests. The Reach viewed winter as a season to be endured with grace rather than a life-threatening crisis. The Westerlands, rich in gold and silver mines, used wealth to mitigate winter's impact. House Lannister and other Westerland lords could afford to import food if local supplies ran short, could pay for extra firewood and warm clothing, could maintain comfortable lifestyles even in difficult seasons. This wealth-based approach to winter created a culture that saw proper preparation as primarily a matter of sufficient funds, rather than careful planning and hard choices. The Riverlands occupied a middle position, both geographically and culturally. Riverlands' winters could be harsh. The rivers themselves sometimes froze, making travel and trade difficult. But the region's central location and navigable waterways meant supplies could usually be obtained from elsewhere if local stores proved insufficient. Riverlands' lords developed pragmatic attitudes, balancing northern caution with southern optimism. The Vale of Arryn experienced severe winters, particularly in the mountains where the Eyrie stood. The Eyrie itself became completely inaccessible during winter, forcing the Arryn household to descend to the Gates of the Moon. This seasonal migration was unique to the Vale, a twice-yearly movement dictating the rhythm of Vale politics and society. The mountain clans of the Vale, though distinct from northern mountain clans, shared some similar winter traditions, including the need to descend to lower elevations or face starvation. The Stormlands, true to their name, faced winters defined more by storms than pure cold. Winter winds howled in from the sea, bringing rain and sleet, and occasionally snow. Storm's End, legendarily built by Brandon the Builder himself, was designed to withstand these assaults. Stormlanders developed a kind of stoic endurance, a cultural acceptance that nature would be harsh, and the best response was to build strong and stand firm. The Iron Islands experienced unique winter challenges. The Ironborn depended on the sea for livelihood, but winter storms made sailing deadly. The reaving that defined Iron Islands culture became impossible during severe winters, trapping warriors at home and creating social tensions. Ironborn winters were marked by frustration and cabin fever, generations of raiders forced to sit idle while waves battered their shores. But it was the North where winter truly defined culture. Every aspect of northern life was shaped by the understanding that winter would come and might last years. Northern castles were built for defense and warmth, not beauty. Northern cuisine emphasized hearty food that kept people strong during cold months. Northern clothing was purely functional. Northern religion, through the old gods, acknowledged the harsh realities of their world, rather than promising heavenly rewards. The North developed unique concepts that other regions lacked. The winter town at Winterfell had no southern equivalent. The idea of a settlement that existed primarily during winter, filling and emptying with seasonal regularity, made no sense where winter was not a prolonged crisis. The tradition of going hunting was purely northern, reflecting mathematical necessities that southerners never faced. Northern character itself was forged by winter. Northerners were loyal because loyalty was necessary for survival. The lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. They were direct and honest because elaborate southern courtesy made no sense when your neighbor might determine whether you lived or starved. They were hard because their world was hard and soft people didn't survive long. They valued duty over glory because duty kept people alive, while glory was a luxury they couldn't afford. The southern expression, "sweet summer child," encapsulated the cultural divide. Southerners who had experienced only mild winters understood nothing of true fear, true hardship, true winter. They might think they understood, might nod sympathetically when Northerners spoke of winter's dangers, but they didn't really know, and Northerners could tell. The gap between those who had survived true winter and those who hadn't was vast and unbridgeable. This regional variation in winter experience created mutual incomprehension. Northerners thought Southerners soft and foolish, incapable of making hard choices, living in a fantasy world where consequences never became truly severe. Southerners thought Northerners grim and excessive, preparing for disasters that never materialized, maintaining cruel traditions that served no purpose. The truth, of course, was that both perspectives were valid for their own regions. Southern approaches to winter worked in the South, where winter was mild. Northern approaches were necessary in the North, where winter killed. The tragedy was that neither side could fully understand the other's position because they operated from fundamentally different experiential bases. When winter finally came to all of Westeros in the later events of the story, these regional differences became stark. The North was ready. They had been ready for generations, maintaining preparation even during long summers because they never forgot. The South was not ready and paid accordingly. Cities starved, refugees flooded south seeking warmth, social order broke down. The North's warnings, dismissed as pessimism during good times, proved prophetic when winter returned in earnest. Long before humans arrived in Westeros, before the first men crossed the Arm of Dawn, or the Andals sailed from Essos, the land belonged to the children of the forest and to the giants. These ancient peoples experienced winter in ways modern humans could barely imagine, facing cold with tools and knowledge that have since been lost. The children of the forest were diminutive beings, barely taller than human children, but far more ancient and magical. They lived in harmony with nature, dwelling in caves and hollow trees, wearing clothes of leaves and bark. For them, winter was not primarily a threat to be survived, but rather another season in nature's cycle, requiring adaptation, but not fundamentally changing their way of life. The children possessed abilities that allowed them to endure winter more easily than humans would later manage. Some were greenseers, individuals born with the ability to perceive past and future through dreams and visions, to communicate with animals, and most importantly, to enter the weirwood trees and access the vast network of consciousness that connected all heart trees across the continent. Through this network, greenseers could see anything that had ever occurred before a weirwood, could send whispers through time, could coordinate responses to threats across vast distances. This meant that when winter approached, the children knew beforehand how severe it would be. They could read signs in the natural world, the behavior of animals, the thickness of tree bark, the early arrival of certain birds. And through greenseer visions, they could see what was coming. This knowledge allowed them to prepare appropriately, to retreat to deeper caves when necessary, to store food in quantities matching the expected winter's length. The children also possessed the ability to skin change or walk into animals, seeing through their eyes and controlling their movements. This meant that even when winter made travel difficult or dangerous for the children's physical bodies, they could scout and hunt through animal proxies. A greenseer might sit in a cave for weeks while simultaneously running through the forest as a wolf, flying above as a raven, stalking prey as a shadow cat. The winter landscape remained accessible to them in ways it would never be for humans. Their small size and light weight allowed the children to move across snow that would trap larger beings. They could climb trees that humans couldn't reach, find shelter in spaces too small for bigger folk. They required less food to sustain themselves, making long winters more survivable. These physical adaptations combined with magical abilities to create a people genuinely suited to Westeros and all its seasons. But the children were not invulnerable. The long night affected them as severely as it later affected humanity. When the others emerged from the lands of always winter, when darkness fell across the world, the children found themselves facing a threat their magic could not easily counter. Many died in that ancient war, entire populations wiped out by cold and darkness and the armies of the dead. It was desperation born of this existential threat that drove the children to create the others in the first place, according to the histories. In a clearing deep in the haunted forest, surrounded by weirwood trees, the children performed a terrible ritual. They took a captive human, one of the first men who had invaded their lands and cut down their trees, and they drove a shard of dragonglass into his heart. The transformation was horrific. His eyes turned from brown to the blue of winter ice. His skin paled to the color of milk. The warmth left his body replaced by supernatural cold. He became the first White Walker, the Night King. The children hoped to create a weapon that could defend them against the First Men's invasion. Instead, they created something that broke free of their control and turned against all living things. The others became a threat to the children themselves, requiring the very alliance with the First Men that the children had been trying to prevent. It was a lesson in the dangers of magic used in desperation, of solutions that create worse problems. Giants represented the other ancient people of Westeros, massive humanoids standing 12 to 14 feet tall, covered in shaggy hair. They were less magical than the children, but more physically powerful, able to survive conditions that would kill smaller beings through sheer resilience and strength. Giants lived in small family groups, dwelling in caves or crude structures, following the great herds of mammoths and aurochs that once roamed Westeros in abundance. Winter for giants was challenging but manageable. Their size and strength allowed them to hunt prey that smaller hunters couldn't take down. A giant with a crude club could kill an auroch or mammoth, providing meat enough to sustain his family for weeks. Their thick hair and layers of fat provided natural insulation against cold. They could tolerate temperatures that would quickly kill humans, though even giants had limits and sought shelter during the worst storms. Giants spoke their own language, a rumbling tongue of simple words and grunts that nonetheless conveyed complex ideas. They called the children of the forest squirrel people, Wodaknagran in giant speech, both because the children were small and quick, and because they loved trees. Giants and children maintained uneasy relationships, sometimes peaceful coexistence, other times conflict over territory or resources. When winter came, giants would migrate to lower elevations where food remained more available, much like the northern mountain clans would later do. They gathered in larger groups during winter, combining their strength and resources to improve survival chances. Multiple giant families might winter together in a particularly good cave system or sheltered valley, sharing food and warmth. Giants contributed to building the wall, according to legend. Brandon the Builder supposedly enlisted their aid in moving the massive blocks of ice and stone that formed the structure's foundation. Giants' tremendous strength made them ideal for such work. They could shift loads that dozens of men couldn't budge, could work in conditions that would kill human laborers. Whether they helped willingly or were somehow compelled remains unclear, but their participation was apparently crucial to the wall's construction. The relationship between the children and giants was complex. They were not allies in any formal sense, but rather fellow inhabitants of a land that later humans would claim. They understood each other in ways that went beyond language. Both were ancient peoples with deep connections to the land. Both faced similar threats. Both had been pushed to the margins by humanity's expansion. During the long night, children and giants fought together against the others. Giant strength proved valuable in battle. A giant warrior could shatter wights with single blows, could wade through enemy ranks that would overwhelm smaller fighters. But giants died too, frozen and reanimated to serve as massive wights in the armies of the dead. These giant wights were terrible threats, combining giant strength with wight fearlessness and persistence. The first men, when they arrived in Westeros, found a land inhabited by the children and giants. Initial conflicts were inevitable. The first men cleared forests for farmland, destroying the children's homes and cutting down weirwoods. They hunted the great herds that giants depended on. The first men represented an existential threat to both ancient peoples. But the first men also learned from the children and giants. They adopted worship of the old gods, taking it directly from the children. They learned to live with winter's severity, understanding techniques for food preservation and shelter construction that the ancient peoples had perfected over millennia. The first men intermarried with those who possessed skin-changing abilities, mixing bloodlines until some human families carried ancient gifts. The Pact of the Isle of Faces ended the war between first men and children, establishing territories and mutual obligations. The children would keep the forests, the first men would take the open lands. Both would respect the other's sacred places. This peace held for 4,000 years, a testament to its fairness and both sides' commitment to maintaining it. Giants maintained more distance from human society, but also generally avoided conflict. They had their own territories, their own ways, and as long as humans didn't interfere excessively, giants were content to ignore them. Some trade occurred. Giant strength was occasionally hired for special tasks. Giants would trade mammoth ivory for metal tools or weapons. But time was cruel to both ancient peoples. The children dwindled over millennia, their numbers decreasing through causes unclear, perhaps low birth rates, perhaps loss of habitat as humans expanded, perhaps simply exhaustion from the long night's trauma. By the time of the main story, the children existed only in small remnants beyond the wall, clinging to survival in caves and forgotten places. Giants faced similar decline. They had never been numerous, and human expansion reduced available territory and game. Giants died in conflicts with humans, killed by hunters who saw them as threats or trophies. Some giants lived beyond the wall with the wildlings, maintaining a kind of symbiotic relationship. But even these were dying out. The mammoths they depended on were also disappearing, taking with them a crucial part of giant culture. Winter for these last children and giants was perhaps harder than it had ever been. They possessed the same ancient knowledge, the same abilities, but now had fewer numbers, smaller territories, reduced resources. They remembered times when their peoples were strong and numerous, when they could meet winter with confidence. Now they faced the cold, knowing they might be the last of their kind, that spring might arrive to find them extinct. Yet they persisted, maintaining their traditions, keeping their ancient knowledge alive. The children still carved faces in weirwoods, still sent visions to those who could receive them, still fought against the others when that ancient enemy returned. Giants still hunted, still told stories in their rumbling language, still endured with patient stoicism. Both peoples demonstrated something humans might learn, that survival itself can be victory, that maintaining culture and dignity matters even when facing inevitable decline. The North was haunted by more than weather. Its winter tales contained monsters and tragedies, cautionary stories about what happened when humanity failed or when something inhuman intruded into the mortal world. These dark legends served important purposes. They taught lessons about morality and vigilance. They explained mysterious events. They kept people alert to dangers that might wear familiar faces. The Night King, not the leader of the White Walkers, but an ancient Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, exemplified how power could corrupt even those sworn to duty. According to Old Nan's stories, the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch saw a woman with skin pale as the moon and eyes like blue stars. He loved her, though she was clearly something inhuman, something cold and wrong. He brought her back to the Nightfort and made her his queen. The Night King, as he came to be called, ruled the Night's Watch for 13 years, transforming the Sworn Brotherhood into something twisted and terrible. He declared himself king, claimed the Nightfort as his seat, and performed dark rituals involving human sacrifice. His black brothers became his enslaved servants, forced to participate in ceremonies that violated everything the Watch stood for. The truth of how he fell varied in different tellings. Some said Brandon the Breaker, the king in the north, joined forces with the king beyond the wall to defeat him. Others claimed it was Joramun, the legendary king beyond the wall, who blew the Horn of Winter and brought down the Night King's reign. What all versions agreed on was that the Night King's name had been stricken from all records, erased from memory deliberately, so that his evil would not be celebrated or repeated. The identity of the Night King was lost. Some said he had been a Bolton, others said a Magna of Skagos. Still others insisted he was an Umber or Flint or Norrie. Old Nan would always end this story with a particular flourish. Some would have you think he was a Woodfoot, from them who ruled Bear Island before the Ironman came. He never was. He was a Stark, the brother of the man who brought him down. Then she would pinch Bran's nose and whisper, "He was a Stark of Winterfell." And who can say? Mayhaps his name was Brandon. Mayhaps he slept in this very bed in this very room. This ending transformed the Night King from distant legend into immediate threat. He wasn't some foreign monster. but rather someone from the listener's own house, perhaps someone who had occupied the same spaces. It was a reminder that evil could emerge from anywhere, that noble blood and sacred oaths were no absolute protection against corruption. The rat cook represented another facet of winter horror, the consequences of violating sacred hospitality. Long ago, a cook at the Nightfort bore a grudge against a visiting king. Whether the grudge was justified, the stories don't say, but the cook's revenge was monstrous. He killed the king's son, baked him into a pie, and served the pie to the king, making the father consume his own child's flesh. The gods did not punish the cook for murder. Murder was commonplace and sometimes necessary, but they punished him severely for violating guest right, that sacred principle that anyone who eats your food and shares your roof is under your protection. The gods transformed the cook into a monstrous rat, forever hungry, forever searching for food that would never satisfy him. Even now, people claim to hear something large scuttling through the Nightfort's abandoned passages, something that might be the rat cook still seeking impossible satiation. This story served as powerful reinforcement of guest right's importance. In a world where hospitality could mean the difference between life and death, where travelers depended on being able to find shelter, violating guest right was not merely immoral, but an attack on civilization itself. The rat cook's fate awaited anyone who would harm a guest, not quick death, but eternal punishment, transformation into something horrible. The Nightfort accumulated terrible stories because it had been occupied longer than any other castle on the wall. Built in the Age of Heroes, it had housed thousands of men over thousands of years. With that much human history concentrated in one location, violence and tragedy were inevitable. But the Nightfort's stories suggested something more. That place itself could be cursed, that evil could soak into stone and wood, that some locations became doors through which wrong things entered the world. Dany Flint's story was heartbreaking rather than supernatural. She disguised herself as a boy to join the Night's Watch, perhaps seeking adventure or escaping some horror at home. Her brothers discovered her deception, and rather than showing mercy or understanding, they raped and murdered her. Dany Flint's ghost supposedly still haunted the Nightfort, a reminder that sometimes humans themselves were the monsters, that women face particular dangers even from those sworn to protect the realm. Mad Axe was another Nightfort horror, a brother of the Night's Watch who went insane and murdered his fellow brothers with an axe. He removed his boots so they couldn't hear him coming, stalking the castle's dark corridors at night. The prentice boys who witnessed his murders gave contradicting descriptions of what they saw. 3 died that same year. 1 went mad, and later people claimed to see all the prentice boys shambling in chains behind some dark presence, suggesting they had been reanimated as servants to something evil. These Nightfort stories accumulated into a comprehensive portrait of a cursed location. Brave young Dany Flint, Simeon Star Eyes, who had seen hellhounds fighting in the castle despite being blind. The 79 sentinels who stood frozen at their posts. King Sherrit, who called down some unspecified curse. All these tales painted the Nightfort as a place where the boundary between natural and supernatural grew thin, where terrible things happened with disturbing regularity. Eventually, the Night's Watch abandoned the Nightfort, moving their primary operations to Castle Black instead. They claimed practical reasons. Castle Black was better positioned, easier to supply, more defensible. But everyone understood the real reason. The Nightfort was cursed, poisoned by centuries of accumulated evil. Better to leave it empty, let winter winds howl through its abandoned halls, let its ghosts have dominion over their haunted domain. Beyond the Nightfort, other winter legends persisted throughout the north. The last hero story told of the figure who had saved humanity during the long night. He set out with 12 companions, a dozen good men, into the darkness seeking the children of the forest and aid in the war against the others. One by one his companions died, from cold, from others, from despair. His horse died, his dog died, his sword shattered from the terrible cold. Yet still he pressed on, alone and unarmed, until at last he found the children and convinced them to join the fight. The last hero represented the ultimate northern virtue, persistence despite impossible odds. When everything was lost, when all hope was gone, when continuing seemed pointless, the last hero continued anyway. This stubbornness, this refusal to surrender even when surrender seemed rational, was held up as the quality that ultimately saved humanity. Northerners told this story to their children, teaching them that giving up was never acceptable, that you fought until you couldn't fight anymore, and then you found a way to keep fighting. Some legends spoke of ice spiders as large as hounds, creatures that the others supposedly rode during the long night. These spiders had never been confirmed in living memory, but the stories persisted. They were said to have legs like spears and venom that froze blood in veins. Whether they truly existed or were symbolic representation of some other horror, no one could say with certainty. But the idea of giant spiders crawling through winter darkness, bearing others on their backs, added another layer of nightmare to the long night's already terrible history. These dark legends served multiple purposes in northern culture. They entertained, certainly, but they also educated and warned. They taught that evil could wear familiar faces, that monsters might be human or might have once been human, that some places and some actions were cursed, that winter brought not just physical but spiritual and moral dangers. Children who grew up hearing these stories developed a particular awareness, an understanding that the world contained more than what they could see and touch. They learned to be cautious, to respect old warnings, to take seriously traditions that might seem superstitious to outsiders. When Old Nan told Bran about the Rat Cook or the Night King or Mad Axe, she wasn't just sharing spooky tales. She was passing along vital cultural knowledge, lessons learned through centuries of harsh experience. The stories also provided frameworks for understanding inexplicable events. When something strange occurred, an unusual sound in the night, an unexplained death, animals behaving oddly, people could reference these legends for possible explanations. Perhaps it was the Rat Cook's ghost, perhaps the Nightfort's curse extending beyond its walls, perhaps something worse stirring in the darkness. This didn't mean Northerners were credulous or believing every superstition uncritically. Rather, they understood that dismissing all strange phenomena as impossible might leave you unprepared when the impossible actually occurred. Better to acknowledge that the world was stranger than human knowledge could encompass, that ancient warnings might contain truth, even if the specifics had been distorted by time. The dark legends of winter ultimately reinforced the North's fundamental worldview. The world was dangerous, winter was coming. Vigilance was never optional, and survival required both physical preparation and moral strength. The monsters in these stories wore different faces, others and whites, cursed kings and monstrous cooks, ice spiders and reanimated dead. But they all taught the same lesson. When winter came in earnest, when darkness fell and cold bit deep, Only those who remembered the old stories, who heeded the old warnings, who maintained the old traditions would survive. We have journeyed together through the deep winter of Westeros, exploring the traditions that sustain communities through darkness, the superstitions born from ancient traumas, and the dark legends that kept the memory of true danger alive across generations. From Old Nan's warnings to young Bran Stark, through the harvest feasts and filling winter towns, past the northern mountain clans and their terrible necessities, we have seen how a civilization adapts when the winter can last a generation and ancient evils wait in the frozen north. Winter in Westeros was never merely weather. It was a test, a trial, a winnowing that separated those who understood the old truths from those who had grown soft during long summers. The North remembered when others forgot. The North prepared when others assumed good times would last forever. And when winter finally came in earnest, when the White Walkers marched south and the long night threatened to return, it was northern traditions, northern vigilance, northern stubborn refusal to surrender that stood between humanity and extinction. As we return to our own world, perhaps we carry with us some of the North's wisdom. Winter is always coming in one form or another. The challenges we face may not be literal cold and darkness, but they are real nonetheless. The lesson of Westeros is not to fear the inevitable, but to prepare for it, to stand together when standing alone means death, to remember the warnings encoded in our stories and traditions. If you enjoyed this journey through Winter's domain, I would be grateful if you would take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories waiting to be explored, many more corners of these worlds to illuminate. Together, we will continue delving into the histories and legends that make these fictional universes so rich and compelling. Until next time, my dear friends, stay warm by your fires, remember the old stories, and know that winter always yields to spring eventually. The long night ends, dawn comes, and those who endured can rebuild in the light. May your own winters, whatever form they take, find you prepared, and may you emerge from them stronger than before. Good night.